Morning, everyone. Welcome. Good morning, Patrick. I didn't realize how early I was making this for you. A nice early morning there.
It's always worth getting up to chat nerdy.
Welcome, everyone coming in. So we have the chat that we'll be using, the Q&A. Feel free to ask any questions. And if anyone wants to chime in on the chat, I know we normally do like where is everyone coming from? Since this is like a Mac one, I feel like we need to ask people like how familiar they feel with Mac OS and see how in the weeds we should get.
The more in the weeds, the better, Stuart. It's where I like to live and play. But I think also we can, for a lot of the topics that we dive into, that we will dive into, there's a nice, kind of start simple and then it's easy to kind of get in. So I think kind of a little bit
Totally,
of something for everybody. It's always the goal.
totally. We'll give one more minute before we get going here. How have you been doing, Patrick? I got to talk to you a little bit a while back, but how's everything been going for you before we get rolling?
Good. Yeah, we've been like jamming out stuff at W, which has been fun. It's really, again, kind of speaking of back in the weeds, really enjoy like low level coding, writing detection capabilities. So that's been good. Also, recently announced, I think we're going to talk about this more, OBTS V8. So a lot of just conference planning there, logistics, but really, really excited about that. It's one of my things I look forward to all year. So yeah, things have been good. It's also spring here. I think it's spring in most places in the northern hemisphere now. So that's nice. It's like flowers and birds and things
It's
off the computer that are also good too. So and how are you? How's things been? Busy
it's funny you
travel?
mentioned spring because it's a nice blustery winter day in Oregon, and then I work pretty closely with Thomas Reed, who we both know, and
Yeah.
it's I'm sure it's snowing over there in Montana. So
Okay.
let me
Well,
pull up.
I'll send you some Hawaiian sun, and hopefully that helps turn the tide. So, when does spring normally start? Soonish, right? Yeah, even in Oregon,
It,
mid
I mean,
April.
it just rains until about June, so hopefully soonish.
Oh man.
Cool. All right. So we'll kind of get rolling. We have a decent amount of stuff to cover, and we'll be kind of all over the place too. Uh, the title is a little generic because we're going to touch on a lot of different things today. Talk some Mac malware a little later on, um, and then kind of set the stage as well as dive into something that I find incredibly interesting, which is TCC. And TCC is one of those things that is one of those Apple mechanisms that is for that Apple produced for user privacy, but it also causes headaches, especially for administrators. So we'll dive into that as well. But before we get started, quick introductions. My name is Stuart Ashenbrenner. I work at Huntress. I'm a product researcher, so I kind of balance between product and security research. And I'm joined today, who usually needs no introduction, but I know we have a lot of Windows people joining too. So, Patrick Wardle.
Thanks for the introduction, Stuart. Yeah, so my name is Patrick Wardle. I am the co-founder of W. We're a small startup building macOS detection capabilities for integration into other people's company. Cool logo there. Also, I am the co-founder of the Objective-See Foundation. It's a 501c3 nonprofit. We focus on a lot of cool tech-related stuff. So we organize the Objective by the C conference. We host student focus Objective for the We events. We write the Mac malware book series that are available for free online. All sorts of stuff, college scholarships, and also, of course, the free open source Objective-C Mac security tools. So those things keep me quite busy, but again, allows me to spend a lot of time in this space focusing on Apple security topics, mostly Mac malware and writing Mac security tooling, I would say.
Awesome. And thanks so much for coming. Really appreciate you joining. It's always great to talk to you. And so the first thing I want to dive into, and uh, I guess dive might be a little of an exaggeration, but I want to touch on how persistence works on macOS. I know there are a few caveats, like differences between Windows, and I just kind of want to talk about how persistence has worked on macOS and where it's been going, because I think there are two different things. And so, kind of to start, just to kind of give a brief overview, this is just kind of a kind of a good visual to kind of understand how persistence works on macOS. And the goal here is to address for malware authors, they want their malware to be running after you reboot the machine. Because if you can reboot the machine and it kills the malware, it's really not doing too much and users can get past that pretty quick. So on the Mac operating system, there's a handful of places where you can persist, both in like the root directory and in user land. And here on this screenshot, you can see some user land persistence mechanisms. So these get stored in like the user directory within a like library launch agents generally. And these are all things that are attempting to persist as the user. And uh and Patrick, I know you've worked on a lot of security tools over your day, and we've kind of seen a shift from this style to more of a an embedded launch daemon, and even kind of some ways that Apple is trying to roll all those up into a single location. Um, have you seen kind of a shift towards that with the persistence on macOS from this, like putting it in a root launch daemons directory, to what you can do now, which is kind of bundle it all together within your app and store it kind of within your application bundle?
Yeah, this is a great question, and this is a topic I'm rather fond of for a variety of ways. So just to reiterate, Stuart, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. But when we're talking about persistence here, we're really talking about mechanisms that malware can employ to basically install itself to ensure that, as Stuart pointed out, it survives a reboot. And this is something, especially on PCs and Macs, not really talking about mobile as much here, that the vast majority, at least previously, used to strive for. Because as Stuart pointed out, if malware doesn't persist and you reboot your system, you would basically clean or inoculate the system. So what we'd see a lot of malware would do is, once it would infect a system, either via 0 days, user interaction, regardless of the mechanism, basically the first action it would take is to persistently install itself. And that's relevant to us as malware analysts and security researchers because, again, as Stuart mentioned, there's a limited number of ways that malware can persist. So whereas, infection vectors are many and varied. So it actually becomes a really good detection mechanism to detect essentially all malware that's going to persist. And for a long time, that's been a majority of the malware, by monitoring or focusing on the few commonly abused persistence mechanisms. And this is kind of conceptually similar to Windows. A lot of Windows malware also tries to persist. But the difference, as Stuart mentioned, on macOS, there's different ways you're going to persist, right? Like on Windows, you have the run one key in the registry, you have Windows services. Those obviously don't exist on macOS, but there's similar things that malware can use or abuse to persistently install itself. And so Stuart mentioned launch agents, launch daemons. You have things like cron jobs. If you're familiar with Linux, those also work on macOS. And so, actually, again, one of the reasons why we want to talk about this and why we like to observe trends is it becomes a really powerful detection mechanism, a very generic detection mechanism. So, for example, if we're monitoring for the installation of a new launch agent or new launch daemon, that alone will allow you to detect the vast majority of persistent malware, because those are their two favorite mechanisms to persist. And persistence kind of has a place in my heart that's near and dear. One of the first conference talks I gave, 2014, really starting to date myself here, at Virus Bulletin, was about mechanisms of persistence on macOS. Because until then, we really hadn't comprehensively got a list of the mechanisms that malware could abuse. And in conjunction with that talk, I released one of the first Objective-See tools called Knock Knock. And Knock Knock's goal was to tell you who's there. If you're familiar with sysinternals, now Microsoft's auto runs on Windows, conceptually, it's exactly the same on macOS. But the true story was, I had a friend whose MacBook, or I don't know if it was even called MacBook back then, their Mac laptop running OS 10, was infected with some adware. I didn't know a lot about Macs at that time, believe it or not. And, so he was like, hey, Patrick, you do computer stuff. Help me. We all have those friends, right? They know you do computer stuff and you become IT for everybody. And so I went over and I looked at his Mac. I could see signs of infection. And I said, okay, cool. I'll download, a tool like Autoruns and see what's persistently installed, because clearly there's something persisting on your system that we need to remove. And I couldn't find an Autoruns tool. And I was like, wait, that's weird. Like, no one's written this for macOS. And it turns out that nobody had. So I said, okay, told my friend, hang on, maybe stop going to adult websites, which is how he got infected in the first place. And, ran back to my house, wrote an embarrassingly bad Python script that would enumerate a few of the common persistence locations. And brought that back to his house, ran it, and sure enough, it revealed the mechanism. I believe was using a launch agent or daemon, really nothing that sophisticated, but revealed the infection on his Mac that we could then remove, delete, and clean up. And as a thank you, he shaped me a custom surfboard, which I actually wrote yesterday. So I was like, okay, cool. A few takeaways here. At the time I was like, wow, Mac users are definitely starting to be targeted with malware and adware, even 10 plus years ago. There was a kind of a gap in security tools. There wasn't a basic tool to enumerate persistently installed software, and macOS didn't have, or OS 10, I guess at the time, didn't have anything built in to show us that or show you what was persistently installed. And then C, being a nerd had its perks, right? Write some scripts, get a surfboard. To me, that was a pretty good ROI, return on investment. But to bring this all forward today, Stuart, you really asked a great question. What are the trends and what we're seeing? And I think there's two main trends we're seeing that I think are a result of two main things. First and foremost, as I mentioned a few times, persistence is a great way to detect malware. And now most Mac security tooling, even macOS itself, which we'll talk about in a second, has the ability to monitor and detect when anything gets persisted. So this is problematic for malware authors because they are waking up to the fact finally that, if their malware persists, that's a very noisy event. And so, it's something that they're now thinking twice about before engaging, whereas before 95% plus, anecdotally speaking, of malware would persist. We're really seeing less malware persist. And Stuart, you mentioned that Apple has kind of introduced some new architecture changes in macOS. What we're talking about specifically is known as BTM, or background task management. And it's Apple's attempt to kind of bring in disparate persistence mechanisms into one single, subsystem. And in a nutshell, what background task management is, it's, well, a few things, but at its core, it's a database that tracks persistent items. And I think Stuart on the slide is showing us where the database is. But also, it's what generates an alert now on macOS that says, hey, something has persisted. And this is a great idea. I actually wrote a tool, released it, I think in 2015, called Block, and it would monitor for persistence. Again, because malware, the vast majority, would persist. And the idea is a tool like Block would just say, hey, something persisted. It would explain what that item was. And then it would be up to the user to be like, oh, yeah, that's, I'm just installing something, or hey, that's weird. I just opened a Word document and now Block is alerting me that something in the background persisted. It's probably something that is a sign of infection. Well, I like to think Apple was inspired by that. I have no proof of this, obviously. But now macOS does something similar where when an item is persisted as, for example, a login item, a launch agent, or launch daemon, there will be an alert shown to the user saying, hey, something persistent, which is, from a security point of view, really good. But again, malware authors are like, now our persistence actions are taking alerts. And so that's something that they're thinking twice about. So in terms of trends, as I mentioned, kind of we're seeing a few things. First and foremost, malware that doesn't really need to persist is not persisting. And we're seeing that with stealers, and we can talk more about that shortly. Ransomware is another example, something that doesn't need to persist. And then, if malware is persisting, maybe it's using more creative events, and we can kind of talk about that more. But yeah, that's a kind of persistence in a nutshell, some trends. Stuart, do you want to kind of take that in any specific direction or add to any of that?
Well, it's interesting you bring up kind of the other persistence mechanisms on Mac too, because lately one of the things we've been seeing uh, for some of our Mac users is I don't know if it's a resurgence or if it's just because it's not looked at as much, but cron jobs, specifically
Yeah,
by ad load. So they'll create a cron job in, one of the directories. I believe it's var at. Um, and they'll create a cron job here in this tabs directory, and it will basically using a cron expression of like time will execute this binary out of usually it's like users application support, and from what we've seen it looks like to be like the ad load adware. So the way we kind of identify that is it's usually within a directory of like a long string of characters anywhere from like
sure.
8 to 16 random characters, then another
Random.
random character directory, and then a binary with just like a single letter, like it's called H or M. Um, and I feel like we've been seeing a almost a spike in these as of late. And it's interesting because that's one of the few persistence items that don't get rolled up into this new directory.
Exactly.
Similar or different than like historically you really kind of look at these launch daemons and launch agents, but that ignores things that persist like in your toolbar, for example. So you might have some tool that kind of runs just within like the context of your toolbar and is responsible for notifying you. And that might not reflect in those directories, but it would show up as a like quote unquote login item, where now
Yeah.
those all get collated up into this BTM database where cron isn't. And I think it's interesting that cron still has been a way of persistence for some of these like more, I would call it more legacy adware, like adware that's been
Yeah.
around for 10 years at least. Uh, it's interesting to see kind of a spike in that as of late.
Yeah, and to your point, I think it's directly driven by the fact that malware authors are, as they usually do, well aware of security improvements to macOS. So I didn't really point out what is covered by BTM, but currently it's just login items, launch agents, and launch daemons. So that means if malware or any software persists using those mechanisms, there will now be an alert from the operating system showing the user that something persisted, and B, that item will then be stored in the background task management database. I guess C would also be there is a endpoint security event that then is broadcast that third-party security tools can subscribe to. So what do malware authors do? They obviously say, okay, well, that sucks for us. We don't like users knowing when we persist. We don't want to be in some database. And we also don't want broadcast events going out to third-party security tools that we just persisted. So they start looking for other persistent mechanisms that are not governed or monitored by background task management. And as Stuart pointed out, cron jobs are not. I think if you do it like via the terminal manually, there might be some alerts. I'm not super. I got to dig into that a little bit more. But yeah, as my understanding is at least they're not covered directly by BTM, background task management. So we are seeing this resurgence of rather more legacy or esoteric, maybe we would even say, mechanism, at least for Mac OS. And cron jobs on Linux, it's like, well, no, Mac OS they work, but like in my past talks on persistence, I'd always like struggle to find examples of malware that persisted via cron jobs. And in the last year or two, there's been several. I'm like, this is great for presentations and talks because now we have in the wild examples. But to your point, I think it's a trend that malware authors are specifically reacting, as they often do, to additional security improvements in macOS and finding mechanisms that aren't currently governed by background task management. And we're seeing other trends as well, where, as I mentioned, malware that doesn't need to persist or kind of in the past persisted because, hey, why not, are really kind of avoiding that now at all costs. And then besides cron jobs, we're also seeing, which is I like to refer to it as like a user-assisted persistence mechanism. I'm sure there's a better term, but the idea is that the malware authors will target an app or something that the users regularly launch. For example, they'll replace a dock icon of something that the user runs normally with their own malware. Now, this means that on reboot, the malware isn't going to automatically run until the user, like clicks on that dock icon and triggers it there. So it's kind of like persistence that's dependent on users. The downside to the malware is it might not always get run, right? It's not as consistent as, say, a launch agent or launch daemon. But the upside is that's something that's more difficult to detect and is not governed by background task management. So always trade-offs for the malware authors, but really interesting to see them really trying to kind of step away from persistence because it's such a noisy event. They know we're all watching it. And now macOS, the operating system, is keeping an eye on persistent items as well.
And you bring up an interesting point there on now that there is this background task management database, you can actually subscribe to events to see if there is something new. And I think that that dovetails nicely into kind of one of the things I wanted to talk about next, which is TCC, because I think the
Yes.
two kind of go hand in hand, which is subscribing to events via endpoint security and TCC. So just a very brief overview. This is kind of an old demo, but like this is the essence of TCC, right? It's these alerts that ask you, a certain software would like to use something. Do you want to approve it or deny it? And what this is it's a collection of databases. Like, so there's one at the root level and one per user that kind of lists out all these software requesting permission to do certain things. And the end goal here from Apple is give more user insight into what's trying to run on their machine, whether it's trying to access, I guess the essence is accessing personal information. So that would be considered your microphone, your camera, your location services, your desktop downloads, and things like that. And I think these two kind of go hand in hand. I think we'll touch on that in a second. Um, because one of the very frustrating things as a security company building security tools is the fact that for a security solution, you need to install a system extension and also have full disk access. And coincidentally enough, like a full disk access prompt is never presented to the user. That's the one where they have to manually go into your system settings to approve it. Um, and so for companies that don't have the budget or don't use an MDM, which is a mobile device management, so it allows you, I guess let's say it's the Apple recommended way to manage Macs. Uh, MDMs can provision all of that for you, provision all the permissions. But if you don't have an MDM, then the end user is actually responsible for clicking through these prompts. And I know Patrick, as someone who builds security software and has built security software, both DoubleYou and previously Digita, and uh, I'm curious, like just your gut reaction to TCC. Like, I think it's great for the users, but it's so hard on like the developer experience. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I have many thoughts about TCC. First, just to reiterate for especially some of the listeners who are maybe more familiar with Windows, TCC, which I think stands for Transparency, Consent, and Control, as Stuart mentioned, is a mechanism in macOS now that essentially protects either sensitive user information and or components of the actual computer. So, for example, your mic and webcam are a simple example. Previously, and we saw this in the wild, a lot of Mac malware, once it infected the system, would want to turn on either the webcam or the mic to spy on the user. Examples would be Fruitfly, I think Callisto, Mokes, Eleanor, a decent amount of lists. And this malware would range for cyber espionage, range from cyber espionage malware. You could imagine an example where, say, you're a hacker and you've hacked into, a computer of a foreign government. Yeah, it'd be super awesome to turn on, say, the microphone to basically turn that computer into like a hot mic or room capture audio device. And previously, the light for the webcam might come on, but for the mic there was no indication, so it was a very stealthy way. And so Apple said, hey, we should probably protect these devices. And now, if anything wants to access the mic or the webcam, either malware or legitimate software. For example, the first time you fire up Zoom, there's going to be alert from the operating system saying, hey, user, do you want to allow Zoom to access the webcam and or in the bank. And so this is TCC. TCC is responsible for monitoring that access and then showing the prompt to the user, and then ultimately managing their response. And besides the mic and the webcam, you have things like accessing documents. Again, makes a ton of sense. This is one of the reasons we haven't seen a ton of ransomware on macOS, because even if ransomware infected Mac systems, say using a remote zero-day vulnerability, it would still have to deal with TCC, because as soon as it goes to access, for example, the user's download directory, the desktops, documents directory, to encrypt the files for ransom, well, TCC is actually going to generically block that until the user approves that. So TCC, in theory, is pretty solid, and from a security point of view, it's still a good thing. But with a lot of security mechanisms, we always see trade-offs. And so first and foremost, users are often inundated with alerts and prompts, and that can be very frustrating. As Stuart mentioned too, this does really impact security tools, especially those that are being developed for end users. So those that are not deployed in enterprise environments. And I'll give you a simple example. One of my tools is a simple DNS monitor. Another one of my tools is a simple firewall. Firewall, pretty standard stuff. And from download till the firewall is running, last time I counted, there were 6 different prompts that the user would have to click allow on. And some of those prompts are good, but I will point out that, my tool is, signed with the developer ID. It's been notarized by Apple, which means they've examined it closely, determined it's not malware. I have the correct entitlements that Apple has given me. So the first is you go to Safari and it's like, hey, do you want to allow downloads from objective-see.org? Okay, sure. And then when you run it, Gatekeeper pops up and says, hey, are you sure you want to run this? This is from the internet. And you click OK. And then we get into some of the specifics where TCC and some of the other operating system mechanisms come into play, where it's like, hey, this is going to install a network extension. Are you sure? Okay, go add it in system preferences, authenticate, and then there's another prompt. And so my point is TCC and some of these other subsystems generate a ton of prompts. And I think a few of those prompts is a great idea, but the problem is, and I've talked to Apple about this, all the teams at Apple are pretty insular. They're pretty autonomous. And so each one of those prompts is like from one team, and they don't really talk to each other a lot. And so, it'd be really great, in my opinion, if at the beginning there was like, okay, are you sure you want to open this? It does A, B, C, and D, versus, prompting the user for 10 different things. And from a security point of view, it's somewhat problematic. Not that we need the user to approve it. I think that's fine. The user should be empowered to do that. But as Stuart mentioned, a lot of the prompts are a little confusing. And I would say about 50% of the emails I get about like, your tool's not working is because the user has clicked, close accidentally, or clicked, OK or cancel or deny. And then they're trying to figure out like how to go back and re-enable that. And I'm not saying that's wholly Apple's fault, right? But the fact that this trips up a lot of people, I think, makes it very confusing. And the end result is the security tool can't function, even if the user is trying to install it. So I think TCC has good intentions and is used in a lot of, does protect users. But I'm not sure how, but I think it could be designed a lot better. And then at the end of the day, there's like a gazillion ways to bypass it. If you look at the every time Apple releases updates for macOS, they publish a document detailing all the CVEs. I would say like at least a quarter, anecdotally speaking, are TCC related bugs, meaning someone has found a way to access the mic or the webcam without triggering a TCC alert, or someone has figured out a way to access the user's desktop directories without going through that TCC prompt. And so that's another thing. It's like, as security tool authors, we have to deal with all the challenges that TCC presents to us for getting a tool fully installed. Whereas malware authors, I don't think are really tripped up that much by TCC, at least competent ones. We've seen examples of malware abusing TCC 0 days. XCSet would be one example. Whereas, they basically just bundle up a TCC 0 day and then neatly sidestep that, and TCC is fully undermined. Eventually Apple does continue to improve TCC, at least in terms of hardening and fixing all these uh, bypasses. In my opinion, I would love to see like TCC bugs on a separate report, because when Apple releases, the security notes, say for macOS 15.4, you have like, kernel bug, you have like remote AirPlay 0 day, like some insane bugs, and then it's like 50 bugs. Like, okay, someone can access the downloads directory if they already have malware running on the system with root privileges, and I'm like, okay, that's just distracting. Not saying those things shouldn't be fixed, but like maybe put them in a different document, because I don't think that those should kind of hold a candle to what I would consider real security bugs or real vulnerabilities in macOS. But to TLDR the whole thing, TCC is a really good idea. I think it protects a lot of users' components of their computers, and will thwart basic malware. But the implementation, I think, leaves a lot to be desired. It's very challenging for security tools. And I think the average user gets inundated with alerts and pop-ups, and eventually they just start clicking allow on everything. And then we actually see malware exploiting that. It would just continually access or trigger TCC alerts until the user clicks allow. And I mean, malware authors are doing that because that means it works. So again, it's one of those things where TCC, good idea, maybe could be implemented in a better way, where security tools can install themselves easier and users aren't at the same time inundated with alerts, either from security tools or just normal applications trying to do what they're designed to do.
And you brought up a good point in, and I saw this in the chat as well about like, is there a tool that can just enumerate TCC for you? And off the top of my head, I can't think of one that does that and as the only job of the program. I know there are a few that can enumerate TCC as part of other capabilities, like Aftermath, which I wrote when I was at Jamf and actually talked at OBTS about, was one of those that can enumerate the TCC database. And you can see here, I just used some commands from the command line to actually open the database, like this root level directory here. And then specifically this KTCC service system policy all files, which is full disk access. And all those live up here in this root directory. So there are some ways you can interact with it to kind of look and see what TCC permissions there are. And I will also add that like you can use your system settings to do it as well. Let me see if I can pop this open without throwing off all my screens here. So they live within your system settings in this. Let me see if I remember where they put it now.
Yeah, they don't make it easy. It's not, I think, again, like
Yeah,
it'd be
this
great to be
redesigned.
like, a TCC viewer or something, but you kind of have to, yeah, poke through all these different ones.
Yeah, so here in privacy and security, you can actually dive in and see like what applications I've given full disk access to and files and folders and things like that. And one thing I want to mention on TCC, and I see some interesting chat in there about Gatekeeper in the chat, and we're actually going to talk a little about Gatekeeper here shortly and some improvements that Apple's made to it. But one of the most frustrating things for me about the TCC process is, let's see if I can get my screen share back. No, I can't see anything. Hold on. I just have a full black screen here. Can you hear me, Patrick?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Let's see if I can get this back here in just a second. But one of the interesting things about TCC is the MDM overrides, and basically the fact that if you are an MDM company, you can provision TCC permissions as part of like the job of an MDM, which allows users to not see these prompts.
Yeah.
However, I think the most frustrating part about it is the fact that these settings don't actually end up getting reflected in the system settings. So I just showed like the system settings on my local machine. These all end up living in a completely different location. So whereas most of them get saved into the TCC database, these all get saved to a property list or a P list, which is just like an XML file that has some keys and values, and all these get saved out here. So if if you are a end user and you're looking at your system settings and you have your MDM on your right and you're trying to provision it, you can actually have different toggles set within your system settings than are actually being implemented on your machine, because I can toggle on and off different things on my machine, but if my MDM is provisioning it, it's going to enforce it regardless. Uh,
Mm.
and it's just one of those things that can be so difficult for an admin, especially someone who might be new to the macOS space who doesn't have to deal with TCC on a Windows machine, to come in and actually then have discrepancies between what their MDM is showing them and what the endpoint is showing them. Additionally, just as of late, I wrote a parser that actually parses this file, and like you can add a bundle identifier to it and actually see if it is getting the proper MDM permissions. And I believe we can put that link to that. And I think we just uploaded it to the Huntress public deployment scripts repository, which I can link to as well. That allows you to basically use it as a fact script, more or less, from like your MDM to pull back those as well. Or you could just kind of do it on the endpoint as well. Just a quick script that can pull all this information. So one new piece of TCC that's actually basically brand new within the last couple weeks is that Apple has mentioned that in this newest operating system release, that you can now see if a TCC permission is being modified or changed. And Patrick, you just wrote a blog about all this and went into pretty deep detail about all this. But I think this is a big win for security vendors to be able to actually see, taking into account the hope that everything is provisioned right in the first place and that you can see the endpoint security events. But now you can actually subscribe to these endpoint security events with a security tool and actually see if TCC is being changed, which previously we had no insight into.
Yeah, this is something that I'm really excited about. So take a quick step back. I think it was in macOS 10.15, Apple introduced endpoint security. We abbreviate that as ES. And what was incredible about endpoint security is it was the first framework developed and distributed by Apple that was built into macOS that was designed specifically to empower third-party security tools. And like I just cannot overstate the importance of that, because before that, as security researchers and security developers, we were kind of forced to often do a lot of very hacky things, for example, to write a process monitor. And so with the release of endpoint security, super empowering, and I was able to rewrite a lot of my tools to utilize endpoint security. And anyone who's writing endpoint security tools or security tools, excuse me, for macOS is going to be at their core using endpoint security. And so what endpoint security does, just to give the 1,000-foot overview, is allow third-party tools to create what is known as an endpoint security client, specify what events you are interested in, and then subscribe to those events. So a simple example, and we'll get to the TCC stuff specifically, is you can tell the operating system, endpoint security, that you are interested in new process events. So there's an endpoint security event for new processes. And once your endpoint security client is up and running, anytime a new process is launched, regardless of how, via the user, malware, by the system, whatever, endpoint security will deliver an event to you that says, yo, new process was spawned. So you can imagine if you're writing a malware detection tool, this is an incredibly powerful capability. But wait, it gets even better. So there are two types of events for endpoint security. There are notification events, which are delivered to you generally after the fact that the event occurred, saying, hey, a new process was spawned, here's the path, the PID, the arguments. But there's also what is known as authorization events. And these are when the operating system will actually tell you something is about to occur and defers to you, your tool, whether or not it should be allowed. So just like there is a process notification event, there's also a new process authorization event. And this will, again, allow you as a security tool to examine the process that is about to be spawned. And if it's something that you don't want to be spawned, you tell the operating system that fact, and the operating system will actually prevent it from running. So an insanely powerful capability. And it's up to you as a security tool to make that decision, but you can, for example, now trivially block any non-notarized software. You can check if it's known malware, whatever you want. So that's all super awesome, super well and good. So endpoint security was released in 10.15, and every new version of macOS, Apple kind of adds new events that you can subscribe to. Obviously, we need an endpoint security event in order to subscribe to that. And so as of 15.4, we finally got TCC events. So before 15.4, you couldn't subscribe to TCC notifications from endpoint security because they just didn't exist. And why this is really powerful is, as I mentioned, at least more basic malware, which is really what's more common and what the average user is going to see, it often deals with TCC by simply bombarding the user with TCC prompts or masquerading as something legitimate, right? Imagine, we've actually seen this happen. North Koreans target a lot of Macs, Lazarus Group, and other North Korean related entities. And a lot of times they will masquerade as legitimate software. So one of their favorite approaches is to send an email to an individual or connect with them on social media, for example, LinkedIn, and say, hey, we would like to hire you. You're, very talented. They go after a lot of cryptocurrency admins and programmers and individuals this way. And they set up a whole job interview, and they send a Zoom link or a webinar link, and you click on it, and it's like, oh, this isn't quite working. You don't have the right, software. Let's actually switch over to, using, our own client. And then they linked you to something that, pretends to be a Zoom installer or their custom chat application. And that's actually the malware. And a lot of times they're like chatting with you while this is happening. You're like expecting a job interview. You're already running a few minutes late because it didn't work on your machine. And so it puts people in a very stressful environment, and they want to, hop on this very important video call for an interview for perhaps a career-changing job. And so, they will, unfortunately, oftentimes fall for this, download and run what they believe is a video chat application or a fix to get their, interview up and running. And it's something that's been Trojanized with malware. And it might ask, for example, access to the mic or the webcam, and that's not surprising because it's pretending to be a video chat application, and the user might click allow. Now, a security tool would be very interested in knowing that something just basically the user relinquished, for example, here, webcam and mic access to some random program. And in the past, security tools weren't able to see this happen unless they were doing some janky thing like parsing log messages, which never really recommended. But now with the advent of these TCC events, anytime the user or anything approves TCC access, whether that's full disk access to micro webcam, there are 10 or 15 different TCC, if not more, I would say permissions that can be granted. Now, endpoint security event will be broadcast. So if your security tool has registered for that, you will get an alert or a message basically saying, hey, FYI, user, let's in this case assume it was user, just approved program X for privilege TCC permission Y. And then you can take action to say, okay, yeah, this is Zoom doing its thing, or this is something that is masquerading as Zoom, but it's not actually signed by Zoom, it has all these other shady characteristics. And then you can make a determination about that to either perhaps block that or detect the malware, collect the binary for continued analysis, all sorts of things. So this is awesome. This is something we've been begging Apple for, I would say, 5+ years. So it's really, really great that they finally added TCC events to endpoint security. Currently, it's only notified. So there's only TCC notify events, which means they are reactive. You'll get a alert, but the event actually happens. In the future, it'd be great if they expanded this to also provide a TCC authorization ES event, which basically means that the security tool could examine what was being granted before the privilege was actually being granted. Because you can imagine in the case of like ransomware, if the user gives the ransomware full disk access, like it's kind of too late. Like you'll still get that notarization, but the ransomware may have already like run its course. Or same with a stealer, right? We'll like grab those files and exfiltrated them, and you'll get a notification event that the user has, given process, XYZ full disk access, which is better than not knowing anything. But you could see, obviously, it would be way better if there was an authorization event that was basically like, yo, this is about to happen. And then the security tool could provide the decision, or, perhaps inform the user a little bit more details. But still, we're very, very appreciative to Apple for giving us TCC events. So whoever at Apple is responsible for that, thank you from the bottom of our hearts. I mean, it only took you 5 years, but we have it now. We're stoked.
And I think that lends itself to kind of some of the things Apple's been doing. And one of the things I wanted to touch on, which is funny, I saw some people in chat talking about Gatekeeper and how Gatekeeper over the last couple of years, or I guess not couple of years, over the last OS has really changed from what it used to be, because it used to be where you would end up downloading some type of malware, in this case, like something called flashplayer.dmg, which is very common Schleyer behavior. And the way it would try to infect you was like right click and open, which was like the gatekeeper override. And like it could also be done through the system settings. If you scroll down, you could just hit open anyway, and it would launch your application. And over time, like you can see here, this is like that exact Schleyer malware, which you can find very, very easily online. But you just pop open this, and it basically tells you, like, this is how you override Gatekeeper, which is checking for code signing and notarization. And this is basically how some malware authors have gotten past that. But since then, Apple has changed it. So if you download even a piece of software that's not signed, for example, like MocOView, which I've used, your only two options are to do nothing or to move that application to the trash, from, like, I would say, general user behavior. So both the kind of the right click open doesn't work, trying to do it from your system settings doesn't work. Really, the only way that I found you can do it is actually removing the quarantine attribute directly from the command line, which I don't think is common user behavior in the first place.
No.
But it's interesting to see how Apple is kind of improving these things, especially something like this, which has been, I would say, a thorn in the side of a lot of general users, and even like people who've gotten infected from this pretty, I would say, trivial way to override, because it's not even bypassing Gatekeeper, it's just
Yeah.
overriding
It's like
Apple's threatened
sidestepping.
behavior.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think one of the things I want to talk about before we kind of dive into the Objective-See Foundation, Patrick, is kind of some of the trends. And I saw an interesting question in the Q&A that I want to pull up here and kind of prompt to you. So uh, the question is, like, when we say Mac malware and infections are on the rise, are there any numbers on this? And I can talk to this as well. And how much more are we seeing? Are people quantifying it? Because it seems like most Mac fans' reaction are, yeah, growth numbers look amazing when you start from almost nothing, which is a good.
Yeah, and I'm going to defer back to you on this shortly, because as a largely independent security researcher, I don't have a ton of insight into, like, numbers, in the sense of a lot of companies that are deploying security software, antivirus companies, they have really good insight into numbers because they can see what their products are detecting. But the products I write, I don't get any metrics from it by design, and so I don't really have a lot of insight. So when I talk about trends and kind of to your question, it's kind of like what I can see from maybe a larger angle, but a lot of times that's somewhat anecdotal, to be fair. But generally the case is, and we've seen this, I would say, with many technologies. As a technology becomes more popular, more prolific, adversaries take note of that and really start spending more time and effort on that, which kind of makes a ton of sense, right? for the longest time, Windows was like 95% in, user deployment market share, let's just say. And I remember when I worked at the NSA, we spent most of our time hacking Windows machines because like that's what everyone our targets were running that and Linux and etc. There was no Macs. Now though, obviously that's changed. Macs are, especially in the US, pretty common. They obviously don't quite have the Windows share as Windows, but I think there is a clear growth of Macs, especially in the context of the enterprise, becoming more common. And Jamf has made predictions that within the next 5 years, they said 2030, and this was a few years ago, so I don't know if it still holds, but they're seeing trends where Mac adoption is trending towards actual Windows adoption. And at some point, there's going to be an intersection with Macs in the enterprise being somewhat similar, perhaps even overtaking Windows. So, if you're an adversary and you're focusing on hacking, say, enterprise systems, you're going to be very aware of this trend as well, especially as you start seeing Macs popping up. And so if you only have Windows capabilities, you're going to start losing clients, you're losing targets, and at the same time missing out on all new ones. And so to back this up, we do have some interesting data points. There was a report from Malwarebytes a few years ago. I think Thomas actually authored that. And he talked about the fact that on their Windows endpoints and their Mac endpoints, they actually started to see more detections on their Mac ones. And it was largely adware. And there was some discussion about how you break that all down. But the fact that there was a discussion of a number of threats even being mentioned in the same sentence as Windows was, kind of eye-opening. Another trend we see that I think backs this up is a lot of malware that's originally written for other platforms, specifically Windows, but in some case Linux as well. We're seeing malware authors now port it to macOS. And we're seeing adware authors do this. We're seeing cyber criminals do this. And we're also seeing nation states. So basically, everyone that writes malware is taking their Windows and Linux variants and porting them to macOS. And again, this makes a ton of sense. The adversaries probably already have all the back end set up, the protocols defined, to collect and process all the data they're exfiltrating. If they have an implant stealer for Windows, it's not that much difficult to port that to macOS. They'll either use cross-platform frameworks or they will just rewrite it natively for macOS. But I think it was a few years ago when I did the kind of end of the year analysis report. I think it was something like 50% of the new samples from that year were only new to Mac in the sense that they had actually already existed on other operating systems and had, for the first time though, had been ported to macOS. So that to me just provides context and reiterates the trend that as Macs become more popular, especially in the context of the enterprise, opportunistic hackers are going to take note of that trend and start developing or porting over their existing malicious creations to be compatible with macOS. So, Stuart, I don't know if you have some specific numbers or want to dive into that, but it's pretty clear from my point of view the increase in macOS malware in lockstep with the adoption of macOS.
Yeah, I think those are all really good points, and it's hard to, as you mentioned, a lot of it's anecdotal because as you write new detections, inherently you start seeing more. So I think the best way to look at it is look to some of the more mature Mac-focused companies that have been doing this for quite some time, to kind of track their trends over time on numbers they've seen. But I think it's also interesting how at least it seems that we have also seen a rise in living off the land specifically focused on macOS. So leveraging things like AppleScript. We've seen that with some of the info stealers, most notably Poseidon. And my coworker Alden actually mentioned this in our Objective-See talk, that a lot of the stealers are incestuous is the word he used. I think it's perfect. Like a lot of them use the same functionality as Poseidon, which is let's leverage AppleScript to get the user's credentials, use those credentials to get different things on the endpoint, and then that's kind of like the kind of the first step to grabbing the password. Because with AppleScript you can kind of simulate the prompts that Apple gives you very easily, and it looks like a native Apple prompt. And so I think like being able to do that, I think has been very beneficial for these stealers and these like traffer groups. I know we're starting to run low on time. If people have questions, feel free to drop them in Q&A for these last few minutes. Patrick, I wanted to ask you briefly about Objective-See Foundation, and as you mentioned, you have a new book. And so I'd love to kind of hear about the Objective-See Foundation. I'm quite familiar with it. I've been around Objective-See now for a while at your conferences and things like that. But for people who might not know, kind of can you tell us a little bit about Objective-See and Objective by the Sea and the book as well?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to end by talking about that. Something I'm super passionate about. So the Objective-See Foundation has now been around for many years. Obviously, it's a play on Apple's Objective-C programming language. And it originally started by providing free open source tools for macOS. So we talked about some of them. Knock Knock, the simple one that shows you, what's persistently installed. Oversight is a mic and webcam monitor. Block monitors for persistence. And the most popular is probably Lulu, which is a free open source firewall for macOS. So that was kind of where our foundations began. And then from that, we decided to grow into something larger. And so now we do a few other activities that some of you are familiar with, but I will dive into them as well. So probably best known as the Objective by the Sea Apple Security Conference. It's something we host every year. It's attended by students, Mac admins, researchers. A few shady people show up. We're okay with that. And it is talks that are all focused on Apple security topics. Stuart has talked there a lot, Thomas Reed, many others. So this one, we're actually up to version 8.0, so number 8 in 8 years. So definitely proud of that accomplishment. And we're going to be hosting that one in Spain. We always do one in Hawaii, where I live, and then the next year we do one in Europe. It just kind of makes it easier for different people to get to. So there's more information if you go to objective-c.org or objectivebythesea.org. And this year we're actually super excited because we're expanding it to 3 days of talks. This is something that people always asked. So there'll be 3 days of training first, and then 3 days of talks. We're set to announce the training shortly, but we have some top trainers, and then the talks will precede that. So if you're interested in that and can participate, definitely check it out. We live stream the entire conference for free. So even if you can't attend in person, that's something that I would definitely put on your radar. We also record all the talks, slides, and those are all freely updated after the conference. Stuart also mentioned the new book. I also have a copy of that. It's volume 2 of The Art of Mac Malware. Volume 1 was all about analysis. So if you have a potentially malicious binary, how do you now analyze it? Volume 2 is all about programmatic detection. It took me about 3 years to write, so it's definitely a marathon, but the first book that really details, if you're interested in detecting Mac malware programmatically, how to go about that. So dives into, of course, things like endpoint security, et cetera, et cetera. It's also 100% free online. The goal, again, with our nonprofit is to make this available to the community. So if you go over to taomm.org, you can find both books fully available for line. Although if you do buy it, 100% of royalties are donated back to the foundation, and we have raised over $30,000 already from book sales going back to the foundation, which helps support our conferences, our student scholarships, and our tools. I do want to mention that one of the reasons we are able to do such amazing things, free books, conferences, student scholarships, student trainings, is because we have incredible companies who support us. And I'm super stoked that Huntress is one of our main supporters of the foundation. So I just really want to thank them for supporting us by not only showing up and talking at the conference, sending a lot of employees, but also, financially donating money to us that allows us to do all this incredible, cool stuff for the community. So, Stuart, I just want to thank you personally, but also Huntress as well. It's really something that without this support, we wouldn't be able to have such a positive impact, both on the community and the greater Mac ecosystem. So, thank you. Mahalo, as we say in Hawaii.
Cool. Well, Thank you so much again for joining us today, Patrick. It's always fun to catch up and chat about fun Mac stuff, which I think isn't super common. So I love to sit down and jam about Mac malware.
It's the
Always great
best.
to hang out with you.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks again for organizing this, inviting me. I want to say thanks to all the attendees for also dialing in and your questions. Really, really appreciate it. I think Stuart's going to post resources for the links of the stuff we talked about, and hope to see lots of you at OBTS, either in person or joining the live stream.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining us today. Feel free to reach out on different social media sites or whatever if you have any follow-up questions or anything like that. Cool. Thank you again, Patrick.
Thanks.